disregard for landowners impacted by the projects they approve is personal and very real for me. My family and I own 253 acres in Southern Oregon that are in the path of the Pacific Connector gas pipeline, which is slated to carry pressurized gas to the recently approved Jordan Cove LNG terminal in Coos Bay, Oregon. Easements on about 10 acres. This land has been in our family for the better part of the past 100 years. It's a connection to our past and where we've put our hopes for the future. This land is a part of who we are. Our father is buried nearby, as is his father and his father's father. So when we were told that a Canadian corporation wanted our land for a pipeline, we were shocked. The first application was submitted in 2007, and we didn't even register as interveners. We didn't know if we could or if we should, or even how to do it if we wanted to. Communications from FERC were intimidating and gave the impression that the pipeline was a foregone conclusion. When we went to some of the early scoping meetings, the only information FERC happily provided was to be sure and ask for trees as large as what would get taken out. There was no indication that this was a project that was being debated or that our concerns would be considered, only that we'd better ask for trees as large as those taken or we'd end up with 2-foot-tall seedlings. We've learned a lot since then, and frankly, it hasn't been from FERC. One of the most important things we've learned through this fight is this: we are outmatched at every level. Nobody tells you what you're supposed to be doing to protect yourself or what your rights are. As landowners opposed to the pipeline, we don't have an endless supply of attorneys lined up to help us navigate the system. We don't have funds to produce reports holding the facts in just the right light so they validate our view. Nor do we have funds to hire lobbyists to meet with Congress members so that they can show how our lives are and will be impacted by this. I would tell you, there's no accident participating in this process is hard for landowners. The lack of accessibility and transparency in the scoping and public commenting sessions, along with the barriers landowners and concerned citizens had in trying to access the environmental impact statements, are indicative of how FERC only plays lip service to including the public in its decision-making process. When it's our land and our communities, every effort should be made to include us in the process rather than placing obstacle after obstacle in our way. In our case, scoping sessions were held in only some of the impacted counties, and often the venues weren't large enough to accommodate all community members who were interested. Most of the pipeline goes through rural areas, and many impacted landowners don't have internet access. Yet, the draft environmental impact statement, that document that gives landowners and concerned citizens an opportunity to see the project's direct environmental impact, was not made available in paper form. When complaints were filed regarding the inability to get paper copies, FERC's response was to make a few paper copies available at some local libraries. In Southern Oregon, local libraries are few and far between, and many are staffed by volunteers, resulting in limited hours of operation. As the printed draft environmental impact statement was a whopping 12 inches high, printed on both sides, locals without access to the internet would have had to camp in their local libraries in order to be able to get through the document. Our fight started well over a decade ago and had gone on for so long that it was just like a looming threat in our lives, like dark storm clouds on the horizon. It wasn't raining down on us right now, but it kept us from feeling secure enough in our future to want to make long-term investments in our farmland. In March of this year, FERC decided that after 13 years and previous denials, they would approve the project. And they couldn't have picked a worse time to do it. March 13th of this year, a national emergency was declared due to the COVID-19 virus. It was officially a pandemic. People were told to stay home and minimize contact with others, especially if they were in the most at-risk categories, those with underlying health issues or over the age of 60. Yet, less than 1 week later, FERC approved the Jordan Cove project, effectively giving Pembina, the Canadian corporation who were the project's owners, authority to start condemnation proceedings. And FERC did this knowing full well that 75% of the landowners along the route of the pipeline were 65 or older. So while elderly landowners were told to shelter in place due to the threat of COVID-19, FERC had given a Canadian corporation the legal authority to start condemnation proceedings. CDC and our governor were telling us to stay put, minimize contact with others. FERC, on the other hand, had just unleashed the legal equivalent of a pack of dogs. Landowners were terrified that people from out of the area would be showing up at their doors. Those who never believed the project would get approval were forced to decide, is it safer to stay put and hope no condemnation papers are delivered, or risk exposure to the virus and venture out to meet with attorneys? With a glut in the market and demand for gas continuing to drop, there was no urgency in having FERC approve the project. Yet they did so in the middle of a pandemic, knowing that the decision would have an immediate and direct impact on those same populations that were most at risk from the virus. Not only did FERC approve this project in the middle of a pandemic, they approved it without it having obtained crucial state permits. States have a right to protect their environment and their people through appropriate regulations. But FERC disregarded Oregon's environmental requirements when issuing the Jordan Cove LNG project approvals. In May of 2019, Oregon's DEQ denied without prejudice the 401 water quality certification. Jordan Cove didn't have a current application on file when the project was approved, and at last check, they still don't. Also missing was the required removal bill permit from the Oregon Department of State Lands. After numerous extensions, Oregon's DSL declined to issue another one, and the application was withdrawn. Again, at the time of the approval, there was no valid permit or even an application in process. Oregon's Department of Land Conservation and Development also objected to the project, ruling it didn't meet the consistency requirements for their coastal zone management area. Still, even without those 3 crucial permits from the state of Oregon, FERC went ahead and approved the project. Despite FERC's willingness to ignore states' rights in the permitting processes and treat landowners like pawns in high-stakes fossil fuel games, there is one area where FERC is particularly reticent about flexing their muscles. They refuse to look behind the curtain when it's time to demonstrate a market need for these projects. In the case of Jordan Cove, this project was denied in 2016 in part because the project's owners had demonstrated no need for the project. They were proposing to build a 230-mile-long pipeline and an LNG export terminal, yet they had no binding offtake agreements. That was in 2016 with a booming economy. Fast forward to 2020 when the economy is tanking and demand for exporting gas has practically evaporated. Of course, Jordan Cove still has no offtake agreements, yet the project was approved. FERC approved the Pacific Connector gas pipeline, saying the proof that it was needed was shown by having booked almost 96% of its capacity. But what FERC failed to acknowledge is that all that capacity was for one customer, Jordan Cove, who, like the Pacific Connector gas pipeline, is wholly owned by the same company, Pembina Corporation of Canada. For all the failure in its processes to vet these projects and its disregard for individual and states' rights, the most egregious abuses of FERC lie in its willingness to facilitate the misuse of eminent domain. And there can't be a better poster child for this than the Pacific Connector gas pipeline. The sole purpose of this pipeline is to transport pressurized gas from a hub in Malin, Oregon, to the Jordan Cove LNG export terminal in Coos Bay. Nothing more, nothing less. There are no feeder lines to supply local utilities, no connections to distribution lines to carry the gas into neighboring states. The parent company of this project is Pamela Corporation out of Canada. That same corporation has permits to import enough gas into the United States to supply all of the needs of the proposed Jordan Cove LNG terminal, which will then cool that gas and load it onto ships bound for foreign markets. So what FERC just approved is the use of eminent domain by a foreign corporation to take land from citizens of the United States so a foreign corporation can make money. It could not be more clear. FERC is asking me and my neighbors to give up our land so that a corporation based out of Calgary, Canada, can make money. And it's not like they are building infrastructure that will benefit any of us. We will have no access to the gas. It's not like we're going to be distributing gas to rural farms along the way. They are not. They are using our land to move their product to an overseas market. It is no different than if they wanted to build a pipeline to move maple syrup from Canada so they can load it onto ships in Coos Bay and ship it to Asia. Except, if the product was maple syrup, we'd have told them, go home a long time ago. But because it's gas, FERC has stepped in and said, it's fine, go right ahead. There are plenty of examples of FERC failing in its duties. And I wasn't going to talk about climate change and FERC's refusal to consider the impact these projects have on it. But my state's on fire. Over 1 million acres have burned. Thousands are without homes. 40,000 Oregonians have been evacuated. 10 people have died. I really wasn't going to talk about how FERC approving project after project after project without making even a cursory attempt at looking at the long-term effect they have on climate change. My state's on fire, and I can't ignore that climate change is a major factor in the growth and intensity of these wildfires. And FERC's willingness to facilitate every fossil fuel project proposed contributes to that climate change. If the Pacific Connector gas pipeline had already been built, right now the 32,000 acre South Open Chain fire would be burning over 7 miles of that pipeline, hampering firefighters' ability to move heavy firefighting equipment or dig fire lines. FERC has broad authority to make decisions on these projects. They need to honor that authority by making those decisions only after deep and thorough consideration for the myriad of impacts these projects have on us and those that come after us. Thank you.